right, welcome to Ryan Research. I'm your host, Peter Ryan. We come here to talk about economics, history, technology, all manner of things. I'm joined by a great guest today, Oliver Kim. He's going to speak to us a little bit about East Asian economic development and how that's applicable to a general theory of development and how those lessons can be applied elsewhere around the world. I'll turn it over to Oliver right now so he can introduce himself.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, Peter. I'm Oliver Kim. I'm a PhD student here in beautiful, sunny UC Berkeley, and I study economic development both in historical context, so as Peter mentioned, in historical East Asia, so the East Asian tigers, China, these rapidly developing economies that escaped poverty in the 20th century, but then also contemporary development in today's developing world, so countries in particular in East Africa that are trying to emulate, I guess, the success of these East Asian countries. So both the historical side and the contemporary side are parts of my research.
Great. And where do you think is a good place to start to really grasp the development knowledge that some of these East Asian case studies present?
Yeah, the from a chronological perspective, I guess the starting point is after the Second World War. You know, in the Pacific, Japan gets defeated, and I think, that was an immensely sort of traumatic event for a lot of these countries. And it basically shattered, I think, the myth of European invincibility. The former colonial empires had been destroyed. And so I guess that's the obvious starting point where basically these countries, in particular, the rebuilding Japan, the newly independent Korea, Taiwan, where very quickly the KMT and the nationalists take over, are sort of working with a clean slate, basically, to start to develop economic policy and start thinking about economic development. It's often kind of said that East Asia was poorer than Africa at this time period. That is technically true in a very narrow sense. If you look at the GDP per capita measures, South Korea in 1960 was maybe a little bit poorer than Ghana or Kenya. In a more broader sense, though, that's probably not quite right. There had been investments, for instance, that had been made by the colonial Japanese government. These places basically had long sort of histories of statehood, in some cases much longer than it existed in the West. But in this very limited sense of, like, these countries were extremely poor. They had escaped basically, in the case of China, something like 2 decades of war. There was an immense amount of destruction, and these countries were basically starting off from a much lower base, basically, than, I guess, like their counterparts in Europe. And so I think, to just set the stage a little bit, there was an immense amount of poverty. There's no escaping the fact, basically, that these countries are poor, but there was also potentially existing sort of advantages that reflected sort of historical features, largely to do with the state, that made these places different and allowed for this sort of miraculous transformation that followed.
And what were some of the guiding principles that they started to think about and implement in their statecraft?
Right. So one very important dimension, I think, was land reform, and thinking basically about, I guess, the income distribution, and thinking about basically getting buy-in from the population. So it's really important to contextualize this in the Cold War. Right. So you had essentially a massive peasant revolution in China. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists get kicked out of the mainland, and they take basically 1 million of their followers with them to Taiwan. In North Korea, you had, the Kim regime. You had a very violent land reform there as well. Japan had a very active communist party. And so there was a very real sort of threat, basically, of communist takeover. And actually, this did happen, basically, in the case that didn't work, which was Vietnam. And so, as I mentioned, these were incredibly poor societies. Most of the people farmed, as they do in most developing countries. And so there was a very urgent sort of political need to do something about it, right? If the majority of the population hates you, as basically what happened to Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, it's very hard to sort of retain your hold on power. And so you had the sort of, this is kind of, I guess, where when you enter the world of development, the traditional sort of left-right sort of dichotomy sort of break down. You had an instance basically where you had essentially extremely virulently anti-communist regimes in South Korea, in Taiwan, um, adopting very left-wing redistributive economic policies. And the most important redistributive policy that can occur in a poor country, in a developing country, is the ownership of land. And so basically throughout the late 1940s and into the 50s, basically all of the East Asian economies that you think of, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, embarked on large programs of land reform. And what that basically means is that they redistributed land. So they took land that had previously been owned in larger estates by landlords, and they broke them up and they gave them out to the tenants that farmed them. Now I have my own work currently that's in progress looking at this land reform in Taiwan. It's potentially there have been all sorts of claims that have been made basically about the productivity impacts of that, of how it improved efficiency. We're finding evidence that's a little bit more mixed about that. But what we can generally say is that from a political perspective, when you're thinking about building a state and you're thinking about basically the capacity of that state even to survive, not even just to think about economic development, but to basically prevent overthrow or to prevent invasion, I think it's a critical sort of dimension of the history of East Asia in the Cold War, that these states underwent these large-scale distributions to ensure that you had buy-in essentially from the population. And from a political economy perspective, I think that's basically what enabled a lot of the sort of industrial policies and state-led sort of economic growth policies that followed. If you didn't have buy-in from the population for all of these things, none of this would have really happened.
So you have the consolidation of sometimes new states that were reformed or states that were given more independence. And as you say, this land reform kind of general policy gives popularity and legitimacy. And then that enables sort of the next stage of state-led development of bringing in industrial policy. So maybe a good way to narrow the focus a bit is to look. What I found is seems like there's an inflection point where South Korea's Park Chung-hee comes to power. And then he starts thinking a little bit differently about how to model the South Korean economy. And he is obviously in the context of the Cold War. He has the North above him. He has China around the corner. He's seeing the sort of geopolitical tectonic plates shift around him. And so there's very much, I believe, a need that he recognized that something has to be done now, fast, and big. So can you explore a little bit of what happens next?
Right. So just to situate things chronologically, the land reform happens, I think, a little bit earlier. So I think it's like 49, 50 in Korea. So Park Chung-hee takes power in a coup in the 60s. But in terms of your description, I guess, of the motivation behind him, I think that's broadly correct. And thinking about, you always have to view this in the context of the Cold War. So the economist Nathan Lane in Oxford has a great paper on analyzing basically for the first time with modern sort of tools Park Chung-hee's industrial policy. But in that paper, basically, he makes the point that the precipitating event in all of this was the United States basically withdrawal from Vietnam, where basically, you know, the United States had poured an enormous amount of blood and treasure into supporting this fairly kleptocratic South Vietnamese regime. It collapses under Northern invasion in 1975, and you know, there's a general sort of mood in the United States, political mood towards disengagement. And so there's a genuine fear throughout a lot of these East Asian former, I guess, allies of the United States that the United States is just going to pack up and leave, and they're going to suffer the same fate that occurred with South Vietnam. So that's very much the context under which I think it's something like a year after this famous conference. I think is it a Midway with Nixon basically talking about withdrawal from South Vietnam that Park Chung-hee announces what becomes the heavy and chemical industry drive, where basically, at least in this era, in order to maintain a military, you need steel production. You need heavy industrial production to make tanks, to make jeeps, trucks, all this stuff, basically to defend yourself against a potential northern invasion. And this threat is very real. At this time, North Korea is roughly at parity, basically, in terms of GDP terms with South Korea. And on top of that, it's benefiting from all this sort of military and economic aid from the rest of the Soviet bloc. And so you really have to situate, I guess, that decision in terms of this context of essentially national survival, where you really see basically an actual acute example of an American client state that basically failed to develop buy-in, as I talked about with this land reform thing. South Vietnam only attempts land reform fairly late, and basically when the enemies are at the gates and the regime is already at the verge of collapse, it's too late. And so yeah, there is a very acute example of a state that fails, and the United States essentially abandons it militarily. And so there is this very strong sort of push, basically, from a survival perspective, to develop the indigenous sort of capacities, to develop your own industries, to develop your own means of defense. Yeah, I think that's a sense in which the Cold War context is very important, especially when we think about other countries in the rest of the world today. If you're thinking about why perhaps the impetus basically to implement effective policy doesn't exist, maybe that's a reasonable factor in all of this.
Yeah, well, we can certainly see kind of the rise of rivaling Chinese sectors stirring a little bit more of kind of a protectionist sentiment, especially in, let's say, Europe, as Chinese EVs start to penetrate their markets. So yeah, context matters, competition matters. So going back to that inflection point, what would you say to perhaps a Western observer that would suggest that South Korea was kind of breaking with the rule of comparative advantage? Obviously, it was at stage A. It could not just all of a sudden go to stage B with this intensive heavy industry. So what would you say to that type of Western criticism?
Yeah, so I guess there's this notion in economics, I guess, of that you're supposed to do basically, as you mentioned with comparative advantage, you're supposed to do basically what the relatively low opportunity cost things for you. If you have a lot of labor, basically, like, you should engage in labor intensive things. Now, I think the problem with that kind of view is that it's static, right? Which is that what you should make is what you have at any given point in time. And a static point of view is essentially, it's antithetical basically to the idea of development, which is that, the things that you have should change over time. And if you want to climb out of the trap, basically, of, what most developing countries do, which is that they farm or they mine things out of the ground and they sell them at, to other countries where they're able to do much more with them. You have to essentially break out of that pattern. And I think in South Korea's case, what made that transformation in part possible, I think, was having a very clear example that was right next door. And Japan and South Korea have a tremendously complex history. It's not always been a friendly one, but there was this very real sense that an industrial transformation was possible because people who are right across the water, who are fairly similar, who have a lot of shared history, were able to do it. It's also not, I think, it's also been emphasized that Park Chung-hee also had, in a lot of ways, an ideal sort of Japanese upbringing. He famously served, for instance, in the Kwangtung Army, which was basically the top sort of Japanese army in Manchuria. And so he essentially had the mindset and the training basically of an imperial Japanese officer. That, of course, had sort of problematic political implications in Korea that were kind of suppressed because it was not good basically to have your president be a former Japanese collaborator. But he had essentially a front row seat basically to the possibilities, at least purely in military terms, of what having basically a modern sort of industrial complex can bring you. And so I think this is one of those things that's very difficult to, I think, prove conclusively in like the context of academic economics. It's like, okay, how do you show statistically that like South Korea copied Japan in terms of thinking about what industries to promote? But if you look at like the sort of narrative history, like in terms of what industries Park basically chose to favor, like it's not a secret basically that if you want to form a steel industry, like you look across the water and you see that it's possible. You see that Japan is making a lot of ships, so you support a native shipbuilding industry. And so that's the sense in which I think Korean industrial policy definitely benefited, I think, from having, in economics, they're occasionally called demonstration effects, having basically a clear sort of model that you can follow, and you know, having I think a sense of shared history and a sense of shared possibility, basically that a transformation was possible. So that's I guess what the argument that Park would have probably given that skeptical Western observer. It's definitely possible. We've seen another country do it.
Yeah, yeah. Can you speak at all to the capital constraints of a country at that developmental stage, encountering where you need intensive investment capital to get these industries going, and that perhaps at first glance, that capital doesn't exist in your domestic borders? Perhaps, you have to go to foreign investors to bring in capital. Can you elaborate a little bit maybe on something that's more nuanced that occurred in South Korea and how it kind of shaped policies to incentivize more domestic capital formation?
Yeah, so there are two events that I would point to, and that kind of illustrate, I guess, the creativity and I guess like the drive, basically, like that this was a national priority, and that they were going to they're going to lie, cheat, and they're going to do any means necessary, basically, to achieve capital formation and to make industrialization happen. So the first event's a little bit earlier. It actually precedes the heavy and chemical industrial drive, and this is actually basically South Korea was it's often forgotten. I think was like the second largest or the third largest provider of troops to the Vietnam War, and this was no accident. It was actually a deal that was worked out between Park and the American government, where essentially the South provided mercenaries for the American war effort in exchange, basically, for the United States doing war procurement from South Korea. And so this was an enormous demand shock, basically, to South Korean industry. I think it's something on the order of 2 to 3% of GDP. It's like roughly an equivalent of magnitude to the Marshall Plan in Western Europe. Now, not all of that was targeted basically to the industries that we typically think of when we think of like the heavy and chemical industrial drive. A lot of this was kind of light manufacturing. So think of like things like, I guess like uniforms, basically, for military personnel. It's a very obvious thing to sort of source from a poor developing country with lots of labor. But there was steel involved. There was some manufacturing, and I think it's hard to argue, basically, that having basically a guaranteed source of demand, of foreign demand for your products and exports, definitely helps, and that helped with initial capital formation. The other event that I would point to that kind of illustrates, again, I guess, the entrepreneurialism of the Korean state, basically, and its willingness to basically seek any source for investment, was that one of the main sources, basically, for the capital behind the Pohang steel mill, POSCO, which basically I think is now, somewhere at one point is the world's largest steel producer. I think now it's maybe 2 or 3 or something like that. But one of the main sort of sources of capital from that was actually a Japanese reparations payment, where basically Park negotiated with the Japanese government that in exchange for normalization of relations, kind of letting, I guess, like bygones be bygones, forgetting all the horrible stuff that had happened during the era of colonialization, that in exchange for this, that the Japanese would pay out, I think, something on the order of several $100 million at the time. And that was basically plowed immediately into the steel industry. So I think there's a potential lesson there, basically, for developing countries today, which is that, these are non-obvious sources, basically, for capital. They're not typically what we think of as like, oh, you send out a bunch of leaflets and brochures and you take people on tours of industrial parks. But these were essentially, in the first case, I guess, an instrument of aid policy or military policy. In the second, I guess, an instrument of diplomatic policy, and kind of using, I guess, the sort of contours of the Cold War to basically stimulate investment. So I think, I guess this just illustrates again that a lot of the sort of driving factors behind this stuff are ultimately political. And so the environment, basically, of the Cold War and Korea's basically strategic positioning within it allowed it basically to attract investments that it ordinarily wouldn't have been able to.
Yeah, fascinating. Can you speak to any internal policies when it comes to perhaps South Korea's monetary policy, or how there may have been regulations on banks in terms of having specific quotas for certain industries, in terms of credit allocation, perhaps having prohibitions on what types of loans they could make? Is there any expansion that you can make on that?
Yeah, so I mean, all of this has to be paired basically. So, in one sense, you're worth what I've described before is thinking about the total amount, right? But then you have to think about allocation, right? And that's really where I think South Korea was particularly special. Um, so, famously, basically, one of the main ways that industrial policy was targeted or industrial support was targeted was through capital subsidies, basically ensuring um, that the interest rates that a lot of these sort of superstar firms or these leading industrial firms paid were in some cases even potentially negative, basically, right? Where the state was basically offering massive concessional loans to these firms in order to allow them to grow to a sufficient scale where they became basically internationally competitive. Um, this this is an important way, I think, of adding some nuance, I guess, to the industrial policy debate as well, which is that at least in the traditional sort of conventional macroeconomic sort of view, industrial policy is often framed as purely just tariff-based measures, right? It's like you put up protective walls, you allow your infant industry to grow, and then you become protective, you become globally competitive. Now, there's a lot of evidence, particularly from Latin America, that often this doesn't end up working out. You turn to like protective walls as a business, and so you start to lobby to keep those up. Um, but I think there is evidence, in particular Nathan Lane's paper, which I encourage everybody to check out, looking basically at what elements, I guess, of that policy were of the broad package, I guess, of Korean industrial policy were most effective. And definitely, it seems that the capital subsidies and the sort of incentives for capital formation in South Korea were probably actually more important than these more conventional sort of trade policies. And so, yeah, thinking about basically how to subsidize capital, I think, is particularly crucial.
Great. So then can you expand on that future timeline as we're kind of moving out of the 60s, we're in the 70s. And so how does South Korea keep evolving from there?
Yeah, so one thing that basically I think so the sort of canonical book on this, or the book that everybody should read if they want to study East Asian, or at least get an introduction to East Asian policy, industrial policy, is How Asia Works by Joe Studwell. Um, and one thing that he talks about basically is the fact that there were all at the start, basically, there were actually a lot of different industrial champions. So for instance, like in the car industry, where now, this is seen as basically a huge success of South Korean industrial policy historically. I forget the exact number, but I think there were like something like 12 initially, like relatively small sort of car manufacturing firms. It wasn't just Hyundai and Kia. There were others that kind of started and essentially failed. And the South Korean government basically what kind of sets it apart, I think, from its peers like in Latin America was it was willing to let the failures fail, and it essentially folded them in and consolidated them into larger sort of chaebols or conglomerates. And so yeah, there is a dimension where like we've talked, I guess, about the initial sort of supply of capital. We've talked about the allocation, but you also have to be willing to accept basically when an industrial policy experiment doesn't work. Um, and so by being fairly ruthless about merging and consolidating companies when those didn't work, you allowed basically for the winners to basically accumulate enough scale to assume the economies of scale to become globally competitive, and that's how you get, I think, successes like Hyundai or Kia, and that sort of extends into the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah, and so as you were speaking there, I'm interested in the concept of thinking about industrial clusters and certain larger firms as like anchors in an industrial cluster that allow ripple effects and externalities that actually perhaps promote more innovation on the sides that will then come back in and, like you're kind of saying, will end up being merged back in. So if you have any knowledge there, you can speak to industrial clusters or anchor industrial firms.
Yeah. Admittedly, I'm not an expert on that. I'm trying to think if there's I guess the idea of like whether basically these spillovers are internal to the firm or they're external is like a big sort of thing in economics. Um, if they're external, right, that's an argument basically for subsidies, right? if that's like literally the definition of an externality, it's not going to be claimed by the firm, and so there's no incentive basically for the um the firm to sort of invest or to innovate or whatever to claim those. And so you need the state to step in basically to get the firm to move to a sufficient size. I think that this is, I guess, where thinking about the size of Korea is also important, because Korea is, it's a decently sized country, but it's not very large. And the domestic market was never going to be sufficient, basically, to support, I think, like Hyundai or like Samsung would not exist basically without the global market. Like these firms individually make up a crazy sort of percentage of GDP, and so these firms essentially also basically then assume, I guess, like an outsized proportion basically of the sectoral GDP, for instance, like a car manufacturing in South Korea or telecommunications in South Korea. And so I guess there is a sense in which in a country that's as small as South Korea, the superstar firm or like this anchor of the cluster can essentially be the whole sector, and can sort of absorb, I guess, a lot of the externalities within the sector because it is the sector. But in a context like the United States, where the domestic market is much larger, and you can potentially support 2 or 3 Hyundai-sized car manufacturers, then there's a sense in which, that actually might actually increase the argument in some sense for industrial policies that to target basically these externalities that are not internal to the firm.
Yeah, so there's definitely some context dependent stuff. The vignette that I always think about is sort of within some of the Japanese examples of, you have a Japanese anchor firm that's maybe doing a lot of the investment in skilling up the labor. Somebody might become an engineer for 5 years, and then they leave that big firm. They start maybe their own small shop. And because the firm is there, they can actually sell their very specialized product to the big firm. And so this actually enables a lot of these smaller firms to start up around them and be successful because there is this buyer nearby.
I see.
If you want to talk about to that.
Again, this is getting a little bit out of my area of expertise. So like in South Korea, basically, like the chaebols are the famous sort of, I guess, pioneers of industrial development. It's like literally translates to conglomerates. You essentially have a large number of businesses that often don't have very much to do with each other. Occasionally they're I guess like vertically integrated in some way. Like you have like a steel manufacturing and I guess like upstream, and then you have like car manufacturing downstream, in the case of something like Hyundai. But that's not always the case. Like these things branch out into things like insurance or like technology or whatever. I again, like I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding basically is that there's a dimension, there's a sense in which this can potentially go too far, right? Like in particular, in the case of South Korea, the chaebols are involved in all sorts of like dirty politics. There was a South Korean president who got in trouble a couple years ago for sort of shady connections. There's a balance I think that has to be struck basically where I think the logic you laid out makes a lot of sense. I think from a sort of a purely economic standpoint, it can make sense basically to have, for instance, these firms, generate linkages with other smaller firms and potentially skill up a workforce. But at least in the case of South Korea, you can also see the potential negative political economy effects. And there you start to run into the problems basically of like the incumbents just wanting to basically protect their sort of privileged position in a market. And that I think is something you should start to worry about.
Yeah, as always, it's not maximizing or minimizing, it's optimizing.
Right.
So yeah, that's always the trade-off there. But so cool. I think we have a nice picture of South Korea. So we have South Korea as maybe one of the earlier adopters of this type of policy stance. Of course, we can maybe say Japan, noted by our conversation. Park was looking across the water and kind of seeing their earlier start. So perhaps, they were the first, and then South Korea copied them to some degree. So as we kind of do this, I'll let you choose if you want to speak to talking a little bit more about Japan or kind of looking outside of South Korea in this time period where we start to see like the Deng Revolution in China, we start to see some other effects across Asia.
Yeah, let me touch on Taiwan very quickly, and then let's
Okay,
move to
great.
the big kahuna, which is China. So like in this sort of spectrum of I guess like industrial policy perspectives, Taiwan is kind of sometimes forgotten a little bit. It until recently, I think like I guess like with the sort of advent renaissance of TSMC, Taiwanese industrial policy I think had been seen as obviously a success because Taiwan, is a very rich country by global standards, but hadn't been able, at least, to create like a world beater, like an LG or a Samsung or or a Hyundai. It never, for instance, was able to develop a domestic car manufacturer like South Korea did. And part of that is, I think, again, it comes down to the size of the domestic market. Like Taiwan is roughly half the size of South Korea. Now, of course, the rise of TSMC, where there was heavy involvement of the state, basically at very early stages, like literally the state comes to Morris Chang and says, "Hey, you got to start this company." Like I think that has kind of obviated a lot of that discussion. So that's like a later industrial policy perspective, but success. But in this like kind of interim period, let's say from like the 60s to the 80s or whatever, Taiwan actually sort of a lot of the growth is actually driven not by large sort of conglomerates, these heavy industrial firms, but actually small and medium-sized enterprises, manufacturing enterprises, that often don't actually benefit from a lot of state support. And that actually, I think I want to link to the Chinese case, because these actually end up having a lot of parallels. So yeah, obviously under communism, growth had been pretty disappointing under the Mao regime. There had been enormous humanitarian disasters, culminating with possibly the worst sort of famine in human history. But then starting in the late 70s, you see this transition towards liberalization. It's important, I think, in the Chinese context to not overstate things. Like there is still massive state control of the economy. This is not like some sort of neoliberal sort of prescription. This is just basically relaxation, I think, of some of the crazier ideas that have gone on during this time. Also, just to nitpick a little bit, it's also not entirely true that all this can be attributed to Deng. So I believe that Mao dies in 1975 or 1976. And there's an interregnum kind of period. And one of the sort of forgotten figures of Chinese history during this time is Hua Guofeng, who's been kind of vilified in Chinese history as like basically a little bit of a Maoist sort of parrot. He's famous for this phrase, the two whatevers, that we would uphold whatever directives that Mao gave or whatever. But in practice, actually, a lot of the sort of initial liberalizing policies occurred under him. So one example, for instance, is typically this is equated with them, but it actually started under Hua, which is the special economic zones. So the four initial special economic zones were started, I think, before 1978, before Deng starts to assume, I guess, paramount authority in the Communist Party. But so what I want to just generally illustrate, I guess, is that after Mao's death, there's a political environment that recognizes basically that a lot of the stuff that happened before was kind of a mistake, and that generally there's a need to loosen up. And so it's not particular to Deng. Deng is obviously involved, pretty heavily in it towards its later stages. But it wouldn't have been possible, I think, if there hadn't been a sort of general sort of political change. And I think that's important when thinking about I guess contextualizing this with respect to other industrial policy cases or potentially the United States, is that the overarching sort of political environment is much larger than any sort of individual. Anyway, so you see under these 70s, under Hua, under Deng to some extent, you see basically a loosening of the state's control of the economy. So I mentioned the special economic zones. Another sort of important, and possibly from the perspective of poverty alleviation and what most people actually experience, is agricultural policy reform. So the first sort of major aspect of that is that there's a price liberalization, where basically most of the farmers have to basically surrender their grain to the state. They get paid a price that's actually far too low. And so, there's just no incentive basically to invest or to grow more or invest more effort. And it's a hugely inefficient sort of thing. And under Hua, actually, the state decides to raise its procurement prices closer to what a free market would pay. Now, this is again not quite like obviously like a free market reform, but it's a step towards that direction of like, okay, this is closer to what a free market, the price that would prevail in a free market. And then gradually also there's the opening of markets and the allowance for local sort of trade. And this starts to cause agricultural productivity to go up. The next sort of big reform is getting back to, I guess, to the land reform stuff that started earlier in this conversation, is the decollectivization of agriculture, where basically, under the communist era, it's something like 1 in 5 people on Earth lived in a Chinese commune. So basically, like, people farmed collectively, you lived collectively, any sort of capital, like a tractor or whatever on the farm was shared. You did labor basically together, like if you were digging trenches for irrigation or whatnot. And basically the state decides to relax this. And it happens kind of in a staggered way across different provinces. But the ultimate sort of upshot is that by 1982, basically the commune system has largely collapsed, and individuals are again starting to farm their own sort of private plots. And from a traditional sort of neoclassical economic perspective, this should be great for productivity. Now, I have some research showing that maybe this is not entirely as miraculous, I think, as people have claimed for at least for yield, which is agricultural productivity per sort of unit of land. My research shows that maybe actually it's labor productivity that matters, and so basically there's a lot of sort of busy work and there's a lot of standing around and inefficiency basically in a sort of communal agricultural system. And when you sort of loosen those requirements, people actually just allocate their time a lot more efficiently, and they start to engage in crucially non-agricultural activities. So things like local handicrafts, local manufacturing. And I think that this is a crucial sort of dimension that's kind of been lost, I think, in contemporary sort of debates about Chinese development. Like there is a framing about China where it's very much about state-led industrial policy, about big industrial champions, and that definitely seems to be true, I guess, in the modern period when you're thinking about like EVs and stuff and the promotion of those industrial clusters. But in terms of what started the Chinese sort of economic miracle, and this very early stage in the late 1970s, this transition from full-on communism under Mao to this more sort of liberal set of economic leaders, I think it can be sort of traced directly back to this land reform and basically the freeing up of time and the formation, crucially, of these rural industrial clusters. Very analogous to what happened previously in Taiwan, but you have local manufacturing clusters forming in rural areas that actually start to produce a lot of goods for export. And so when you think about basically like the canonical, like made in China, like the cheap t-shirt that you buy for like $5 at Walmart or whatever, this is like kind of the genesis of that. And it actually ties into the Taiwan case, where there are a lot of Taiwanese industrialists who see basically the potential in this sort of approach and start to invest, largely through the conduit of Hong Kong, start to invest basically in southern China and start to transmit basically their manufacturing expertise and their capital. So I just want to paint a very broad picture. It's like we've started basically from collective farming, agriculture, or whatever, but this is really, I think, the genesis of thinking about how Chinese industrial growth starts. It's really with a loosening of the state's basically the state's control of the economy, and it's sort of the indigenous, I guess, the local sort of formation of these rural industrial clusters.
So yeah, so just so I have the A to B connection together here, you're saying that with the land reform came some inefficiencies, but then once the government recognized those inefficiencies, it allowed a little bit more market access and liberalization, and then through that allowed, as you say, a little bit probably more cash, more leisure time to focus on some other stuff, and that enabled then these rural industrial clusters to kind of spontaneously form, and then that kind of allowed for everything that came after.
Yeah, I mean, so this was like China's industrialization in a lot of ways was kind of an unintended consequence. Like people forget basically, I mean, So why was there a famine basically that killed 30 million people? It was because you actually had a state that was hell-bent on industrialization. You had slogans like, we want to, we want to exceed the United Kingdom in X number of years. We want to catch up to the United States. It's not actually that the Maoist regime was not concerned with development. It was that it was like monomaniacally concerned with development and industrialization. Um, Famously, this has kind of been lost, I guess, also in the history of this stuff. But there was an enormous sort of investment called the Third Front throughout the late 1970s that assumed a crazy percentage of GDP. It's something like 10 or 15% or something like that, where basically because of the fear of a nuclear attack by the United States, China basically moved and constructed industrial clusters in the heartland, in these incredibly mountainous areas where essentially it doesn't make any economic sense to build a lot of factories or whatever, but they chose to do it for national security reasons. This is even after, I guess, the sort of failure of the Great Leap Forward. The famous examples, I guess, of like the I guess like ideologically highly fervent, motivated villagers, trying to meet steel production quotas or pig iron production quotas and burning down all their household pots and pans and these household furnaces and smelters and basically rendering them entirely useless. So there was an enormous sort of I guess amount of energy and capital dedicated by the state during the Maoist era to develop local industrial capacity. Some of it actually, I think, was a success in the sense that if you throw an exorbitant amount of money and resources and human effort at something, you will get stuff to move. But the overall sort of developmental picture was pretty bad. And ironically, it's actually the result of the state's loosening of control after Mao dies. It's loosening of control over the communes and basically saying like, look, we kind of want to get you guys off the books. Like it's actually costing us a lot of money, for instance, to buy all your agricultural produce or whatever at these new prices. We just invaded Vietnam. That was very expensive. There's a budget deficit. We need to make ends meet. And so it was entirely, I guess, an unintended consequence, I think, that you had the formation of these rural industrial clusters. As a result of this loosening control in the countryside, farmers essentially are become more productive in terms of their labor. They're able to allocate labor away from kind of useless busy work farming towards potentially more sort of productive tasks like manufacturing. And so I guess that's one of the ironies of in the history, I guess, of Chinese industrial development from a very long point of view, which is that you had a state that tried everything and was willing to kill tens of millions of people, basically, in pursuit of industrialization. But it's the moment, basically, that it chooses to sort of relax and pursue other goals that the population is free to start to, I guess, like these latent, I guess, entrepreneurial and industrial sort of capacities emerge.
Fascinating. So I've often, when I'm reading about this subject, it seems like Western literature often portrays a non-agency to the Chinese in their development. And there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that while, yes, the Chinese maybe did something like special economic zones as an explicit policy, it was very much, it was the US or other Westerners coming in to provide investment and to buy from them. And there's this attitude in Western literature that kind of portrays that. Have you found that? What are your thoughts on that? And if you have a disagreement, where do you think they go wrong?
Yeah. So I mean, like the special economic zones, I think get a lot of attention. They're like they're obvious and flashy in some sense, and in some sense they're possibly, I think, the most replicated, I guess, policy aspect of the Chinese sort of economic miracle. Like there's somebody who's done some tally, I think, of like the number of like export processing zones or special economic zones worldwide, and just broadly, like they have just not experienced, I think, the same level of success, at least that they're perceived to have in China. Yeah, I definitely agree that I think that the narrative, I think, should not be Western centric in terms of the agency here. When thinking purely about, I guess, like poverty alleviation, I think like what really matters ultimately, which is that the welfare of your people and the number of people who are lifted out of poverty. Most of the major gains occurred basically in the 1980s, before basically, like what China was admitted to the WTO in 2002, I think, right? Before I guess like the special economic zones and sort of Western industrial investment assumed, I guess, the scale that it later did. It really, I think, yeah, and when thinking about this, the scale of China, right? Like I mentioned, there were 800 million people or something like that that lived in the commune system. Something like 2/3 of them transitioned basically from the commune system, from agriculture into manufacturing. And you compare that to the size of the special economic zones, like Shenzhen is big, but there were like 4 of them initially. Like that's maybe a total of what, like less than 100 million people. The scale basically is completely off. And so if you want to think about basically what are the sort of dominant factors that are driving this huge sort of this large scale industrial transformation, it just the numbers just don't add up that it was Western investment. It really had to have been basically these domestic capabilities and in particular all this sort of exciting stuff that was happening in the countryside with these small and medium enterprises. I think that's really where if you want to think about the driving engine, I don't want to say that the Western investment, the special economic zones, all the knowledge that was transmitted, I don't want to say that's not important, but the sort of true driver in terms of the number of people moved and the engine, I guess, of the massive growth, you have to locate that, I think, in what happened in the countryside in the late 70s and early 80s.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Ryan Research Podcast. If you enjoyed this free portion of the podcast, we invite you to subscribe and access the full episode for more insights. Click the link in the description to become a member and elevate your understanding of economics, history, and technology. Your support enables us to continue delivering high-quality content. Make sure to listen to the next part to find out where you can follow our guest. Great. Well, so can you please tell people more about where to find you, where to follow you, if you have upcoming work you'd like people to review? Please elaborate.
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is Oliver W. Kim. But I think the place where I'd most likely to find me is my blog, Global Developments, where I write a lot about these issues, thinking about historical development, contemporary development issues, hopefully with a little bit of a literary spin. So I'm not going to be commenting, I think, so much on everyday, I guess, news cycle stuff, but thinking in a longer term sort of sense about the sort of broader fundamental drivers of growth and development in the world. I have a couple of papers that should be coming out this summer. I have a paper on this Taiwanese land reform issue, which is a long-standing, I guess, developmental debate. And later in the summer, I hope to finish a draft, I guess, of this paper on the CFA franc, which I haven't mentioned, but is a monetary policy institution in French West Africa that could potentially be doing a lot of harm.
Excellent. So thank you so much for your time. This was a fascinating discussion, very educational. And I will try to include any citations that are important or some of the links you talked about in the description below for the listeners. And thank you to the listeners for your time. All right.